Hello and welcome to Bible Class Topics. Today we continue our study of Matthew's Gospel with a look at Matthew chapter 2. Before we get into that, however, let's begin with a review. We've divided our study of Matthew's Gospel into 5 parts: the coming of the King, proclaiming the kingdom, facing rejection, enduring the cross, and conquering death. We began our study in chapter 1 of the coming of the King, and we've already looked at his genealogy and his birth. We'll continue now in chapter 2 by looking at his early life. I've divided chapter 2 into these parts: the birthplace of the King, the crafty King, gifts for Christ, escape to Egypt, the slaughter of the children, the return to Nazareth, and the years between. Let's read these first 2 verses of Matthew chapter 2. I'll read from the English Standard Version. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born the King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. Matthew continues to choose incidents in Jesus' life that illustrates the major themes of his gospel, namely Christ's fulfillment of prophecy, his kingship, antagonism from the Jews, and the triumph of God's will over hostile opposition. Note especially in this section the contrast between the Jews and the Gentiles. Kenneth Chumley, in his commentary, shares this. At the beginning of the chapter, a Gentile delegation from the east comes to worship Christ. Near the end, Christ is exiled to the west, to a Gentile country for sanctuary. All this sets the stage for contacts Christ will have with Gentiles throughout his ministry and reminds us of the universal nature of his kingdom. Bethlehem, located 6 miles south of Jerusalem, was the burial site of Rachel, the home of Ruth and Boaz, and the home and the city of David. Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. The Jews expected the Messiah to come from Bethlehem. Who were these Magi? No one knows for certain, but some believe they were a sect of the Medes living in Persia and acting as priests to the Persians, much as the Levites were priests to the Jews. In the ancient times, they were men skilled in philosophy, medicine, and natural sciences. At their best, they were good and holy men who sought for the truth. Later, the word Magi evolved into the word magus, which came to mean charlatan, and was applied to men in the New Testament such as Elymas and Simon the sorcerer in Acts chapter 13 verses 6 and 8 and Acts chapter 8 verses 9 and 11. Obviously, these men were astrologers as they studied the stars, and they were surprised when a new and brilliant star appeared in the sky. Secular history tells us that all over the East during this time, people, not just wise men, were on the lookout for a new kingdom to rise. Other Magi are recorded as visiting other places in search of a new king. At the time of Christ's birth, men were looking for someone. They were expecting God or their gods to send them a sign. When Jesus did come, it's no surprise that the people came from the ends of the earth searching for him. Let's continue our reading in verses 3 through 9 and see about this crafty king. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him, and assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it was written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will be shepherd to my people Israel." Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that had seen, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. The crafty king is Herod the Great, and Herod was disturbed. From the Roman government's point of view, Herod the Great had been a great king over Judea. He had kept the peace as governor and then king for about 40 years. No one before him had been able to do this. He had been a generous king, and he had rebuilt the temple, but his flaw was he was overly suspicious of everyone and everything. He had murdered his wife, he had murdered his mother-in-law, and he had murdered his 3 sons because he suspected them of plotting against him. It is no surprise that the coming of the wise men with their message would trouble both Herod and Jerusalem. The religious aristocracy and the theologians were brought in to determine where the anointed one must be born. They quoted to Herod Micah 5:2. Herod then lies to the wise men and sends them to find the young child. How do men stand with regards to Jesus Christ? Not only in the time of his birth, in the time of Herod, the time of his life, but in now. Well, 3 ways. They meet Jesus with a reaction of hatred and hostility, some men do. Herod wanted no one to interfere with his life, or his place, or his power, or his influence. And from his point of view, this child must be destroyed. Some people react with a complete indifference. At this point, the chief priests and scribes could not care less about some child born in Bethlehem. They were too busy, engrossed in their own traditions, to give this baby much of a thought. But thirdly, men sometimes regard Jesus Christ with a reaction of adoring worship. This is the Magi. They came with the desire to lay the noblest gifts they could find at his feet. As I think about this, I have to think about what kind of man am I? How do I stand with regards to Jesus Christ? Do I react to him with hatred and hostility? Do I react to him with complete indifference? Or do I react to him with adoring worship? We'll continue reading and see what these gifts were. Picking up again in verse 9, after listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until they came to rest over a place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, and going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. 3 wise men? Were there just 3 wise men? The Bible never tells us how many wise men there were. The legends abound. Early legends had 12 wise men. Other legends had them as kings. We have a song we sing in the holiday season, "We 3 Kings." We do not know if there were 3 wise men. We do know that there were 3 gifts. Let's talk about these 3 gifts and what these gifts might have meant. Gold is a gift for a king. We need to remember that Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. When we come to Jesus, we come to him on his terms and not our terms. And to be his friend, we must first submit to him. So gold is an appropriate gift for Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. Frankincense is the gift for a priest. Temple worship and temple sacrifices were accompanied by sweet perfume of frankincense. The Latin word for priest means bridge builder, and so Christ spans the mighty chasm between God and man as our ultimate high priest. Myrrh, however, is a gift for one who is to die. It was used in the ancient embalming process. Jesus came into the world to not only live for man, but to also die for man. And that's why Jesus is sometimes called a priest after the order of Melchizedek in the Old Testament. Melchizedek was a prophet, he was a priest, and he was a king. And so Jesus Christ is also. Even in his cradle, the gifts of the Magi foretold that he would be the true king. He would be the perfect high priest, and in his death, the supreme savior of men. Why didn't the Magi see Herod's scheme? Why couldn't they tell this man was evil? Often, the guileless cannot detect hypocrisy. And while it's a blessing sometimes to be naive, it also can get us in trouble. Thankfully, the wise men were told in a dream not to return back to Herod. Now we'll continue reading, starting in verse 13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose, and he took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. And this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. So the dream was flee to Egypt to escape the murderous intentions of Herod. Why Egypt? Well, let's think about that for a moment. Later foes of Christianity would use this stay in Egypt as a knock against Jesus, due to the belief, especially of the Jews, that Egypt was the land of black magic. However, we see from Matthew's indication that they did flee to Egypt to fulfill prophecy. I want to read some more from Kenneth Chumley. Chumley says that Smith, in his commentary, argues persuasively that all of Hosea 11:1 is a personal messianic prediction, and that the passage refers to the Exodus only in a remote, elusive sense. From his book, What the Bible Says About the Promised Messiah, page 239. His contention is that Hosea 11:1 is the conclusion to the preceding context rather than the introduction to what follows. In chapter 10:1, God accuses Israel of being an empty vine as evidenced by her idolatry, her reversion to the conduct of Benjamin during the time of the judges, and her wickedness and iniquity. For all this to be punished, a ruthless enemy would spoil her, sparing neither mother nor child, and her king would be utterly cut off. What follows in 11:1 is typical in the prophets in that God gives his chastened people hope through the promise of a Messiah. For example, Hosea chapter 3, verses 4 and 5. Taken as a genuine prediction, Hosea 11:1 adds several important points to the messianic expectation. 1, the Messiah would be an Israelite. 2, the messianic Israel would come into the world as a child. 3, God would have a special loving concern for this messianic child. 4, messianic Israel, like the man Israel and the nation Israel, would spend some time down in Egypt. And 5, messianic Israel would be the Son of God. Hosea 11:1 may allude to Israel's experience in Egypt, but the connection between Hosea 11:1 and Matthew 2 is tighter than many think. Note that this is the first time in Matthew where Jesus is explicitly identified as God's Son. Now, let's get back to our Bibles and let's read concerning the slaughter of the children. Continuing on in verses 16 through 18. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time he had ascertained from the wise men. Verse 17, Then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. We know that Herod was evil, and we know from secular writings Herod was the master assassin. Let me read a short passage from Barclay's commentary on Matthew concerning Herod. Herod had no sooner come to the throne than he began annihilating the Sanhedrin, the supreme court of the Jews. Later, he slaughtered 300 court officers out of hand. As we mentioned earlier, he later murdered his wife, Mariamne, and her mother, Alexandra. He murdered his eldest son, Antipater, and 2 other sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. And in the hour of his death, he arranged for the slaughter of the notable men of Jerusalem. So when we talk about a man who was capable of evil, we are talking about Herod, the master assassin. So to think that he slaughtered children is no far stretch for a man who had already done all the rest of this murderous destruction. This slaughter would have possibly taken the lives of 20 or 30 babies in Bethlehem and the surrounding area, according to some commentators' figuring. Secular history, however, does not account for this slaughter. Why? In a land where slaughter was a frequent occurrence, these 20 or 30 babies would just not make the news, except, of course, for their grieving families. Because secular historians did not record it does not mean it did not happen. Once you know Herod, this slaughter seems only natural to his depraved mind. And so we see the ends men will go to try and eliminate Jesus. Once again, we want to talk about prophecy being fulfilled. And once again, I want to turn to a passage from Chumley and share it with you. The outcry of the mothers of Bethlehem to the massacre fulfilled Jeremiah 31:15. Ramah was a Benjamite city where the Judean captives were gathered for deportation to Babylon. Jeremiah 40:1. In Jeremiah 31:15, the mothers of Judah are personified as Rachel, Jacob's favorite wife, an idealized mother of Israel, who is pictured weeping inconsolably over her children's misfortunes. Her cry was a double lament, weeping first over the children of Israel's captivity and now over their murder. It is frequently overlooked that Jeremiah 31:15, a verse of sorrows, is immediately followed by a message of hope. In 31:16 and 17, the prophet says, "Thus saith the Lord, refrain thy voice from weeping and thine eyes from tears. There is hope in thine end, saith the Lord, that thy children shall come again to their own border." Rachel's sorrow would be temporary, for the child who came to destroy death had escaped death. God's purpose, not Herod's, would ultimately prevail, thereby ensuring that bereavement would be turned into blessing and that death would be swallowed up in victory, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 54. Now let's move on in our reading, beginning in chapter 19, and we'll read through 23. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead. And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father, Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and he lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. In his will, Herod divided the land into 3 provinces and put 3 of his sons over each one of them. Archelaus was over Judea, Antipas was over Galilee, and Philip was over the northeast region. Archelaus followed in his father's bloody footprints, so God sent Joseph another dream and guides him to Galilee, where Herod Antipas ruled. The city of Nazareth was a small town, and the caravan route to Egypt passed nearby. And from up on the hill, a view of the great sea was available if you went out from the town and up into the mountains. Jesus was brought up in a town that was crossroads for east and west, and as a lad, he was exposed to travelers from throughout the known world. But the town itself was a backwater town, and it was really a town for poor people and artisans, according to secular history. Was prophecy fulfilled, as Matthew states? I want to read just one more time today from Chumley, and this time what he has to say about this prophecy. Of special note is Matthew's 5th fulfillment passage. He shall be called a Nazarene has long been an enigma, for it appears nowhere in the Old Testament. How then could Christ's upbringing in Nazareth fulfill that which was spoken of by the prophets? Matthew doesn't say explicitly, but he does give a hint that points to an answer. By using the plural prophets, he attributes the quote to the prophets collectively, which implies he is summarizing a prophetic theme rather than referencing a specific prophecy. In the obscurity of Nazareth, the Old Testament predictions of a humble, despised background for the Messiah found their fulfillment when we read such passages as Psalm 22, 6 through 8, and Isaiah 49, 7, Isaiah 53, 2 through 3, and Zechariah 11, 4 through 14. As D.A. Carson writes, Jesus grew up not as Jesus the Bethlehemite with its Davidic overtones, but as Jesus the Nazarene with all the sneering and distaste that was in the mouth of the Jews for such a poor city of Galilee. When Christians were referred to in Acts as the Nazarene sect, chapter 24 and verse 5, that expression was meant to hurt, not to encourage. Well, what of the years between? There are really 30 years of relative silence. We have a little bit that we can find out about Jesus in those years by reading the other Gospels, but not very much. Here's what we can draw as conclusions. That he grew up in a good home, that he was surrounded by loving parents, he had brothers and he had sisters. Apparently, Joseph died while Jesus was growing into manhood. So Jesus would then take on the duties of head of the house, being the eldest son. We know that Jesus learned to be a working man. He worked so that he might know what our life was like in knowing those slings and arrows common to man. By knowing those things, knowing how a man lived and living as a man, he would know how to help us along the way. He performed the lesser task before the greater task was given to him. He was faithful in a little so that he could be master of much. We cannot forget that this is the everyday performance of our duties that make our destiny final. The sources I used in preparing these notes for Chapter 2 include the Holy Bible, the English Standard Version. I'll put a link in the description below to a place where you can get a free copy of that Bible. Also, I was reading today from the Gospel of Matthew, Kenneth L. Chumley. I'll put a link to Amazon where you could pick up a copy of that if you wish. And also, I would read from William Barclay's The Gospel of Matthew today, and I'll put a link to Amazon for that book as well. So that concludes what we have to say about Matthew chapter 2. Next time, we'll move on into Matthew chapter 3, and we'll discuss the baptism of Jesus. I would like to thank you for watching. I appreciate your support. If you like this video, please hit the like button below, and if you would subscribe to this channel, it would really help me in the long haul. I'm scheduling these Matthew videos to upload sometime late Sunday evening or early before 7 a.m. Eastern Time on Mondays. Until next time, may the good Lord love you, and may He bless you, and we'll see you again down the road. Thank you.